Good evening, everyone, and I'm really glad that you could join this Phoenix Consulting webinar on value stream mapping. My name is Lisa Smith, and I'm going to go through with you what value stream mapping is, why you'd want to do it, how you do it, what would you do with it in order to redesign your service. And it's the how bit that is probably going to take up the majority of this webinar, about 20 minutes or so. So, what is value stream mapping? Well, essentially, it's walking the pathway of the service yourself to create a diagram on how your process currently works, and you'll sketch it out to end up something with a diagram, something looking like this. So it shows all the actions that are required in the process, whether they add value or not. Okay, so it's purposefully working on the whole thing, the big picture stuff. So you get a diagram that documents all the stages in a process, the time taken at each stage, the number of staff that's involved at each point in the process, the weights between the steps. Now, these are both in terms of time waiting along the bottom and quantity of stuff that's waiting between steps in the triangles. You get the flow of information and the other departments that might be involved, and any likelihood of overproduction. Now, if you remember back to your waste stuff, overproduction is your cardinal sin of waste in a lean management system. So you might be doing too much too soon that the next process step can't actually cope with, which ties up resource and is disrespectful to staff in your department. We'll also map any initial ideas or issues that are volunteered at this early stage, but these might be few and far between at this moment in time as you go around doing a walk. Any issues that staff share with you, it's important to try and collect them in little cloud outbursts, and any ideas in idea clouds might be valuable to collect at this point, just so that you don't lose them. And then ultimately you're going to have a summary of the overall lead time and touch time, plus a calculation of your value added time in the process, and finally what the pace of your process should be. So you can see there's an awful lot going on in a value stream map, and we're going to go through it in finer detail in a moment. So why would you do it? Well, we're not just after isolated victories of removing waste in a single process step. We're trying to map the whole process in order to improve the whole of flow in that value stream. We're doing it to identify not only the waste itself, but the actual source of the waste, and to provide a common language for the team to talk about the process in its entirety. The map makes flow really apparent, so you can be really open and honest about when things grind to a halt, and you can discuss flow issues and what stops flow at any one time. It sort of ensures where you can see where the real problems are, and that might stop you from cherry picking only those problems that are really easy to solve. So it makes you do the really nitty-gritty stuff. The discussions that you might have following drawing your value stream map can form a basis of an action plan, and it shows the link between material flow and information flow. So ultimately, the map provides a baseline snapshot of your processes, warts and all, whether you like them or not. So it's the kind of as it actually is, as it actually happens now. So how do we do it? Well, remember, we're talking about value stream mapping, not process mapping here. So keep it relatively high level, and don't do the nitty-gritty detail of what actually happens at every single step. Focus on the really high volume of work. Now, we call that the green stream. This is the sort of the regular, the run-of-the-mill stuff that happens 80% of the time. But the important thing to stress is collect really true and accurate information by walking that process yourself. Don't be tempted to sit in an office and knock something up on a computer as to how you think the process works or assume it works. And a top tip probably from me would be to get a gang together and do it as part of a waste walk. So I would, as part of the waste walk, I would be sketching the value stream map as I went along. But you might want to get one person to sketch out the steps, one person to have a stopwatch and collect some timings for you, another person with a camera and maybe document a photo journey as you go along, just to add to it. And then your last person might collect issues, niggles and ideas from the staff as you go through the process. So let's show you how to pull one together, and it literally takes just 11 steps, that's all. And I'm really conscious that the audience listening to this will be from different backgrounds and from different services listening to this recording. So I'm going to intersperse some radiology and some pathology examples so that you can see that the principles of mapping are the same. It doesn't really matter what discipline or what work area you're actually from. But remember, really start with what happens 80% of the time. So you might need some data in order to define that if you're unsure, but really focus on that 80% of stuff going through your department or your work area. And step one is relatively simple because it's establishing and agreeing your scope. So define where your start and end of your map is actually going to be. What I would say, a big plea from me would be, please draw these maps by hand. I'm going to show you lots of typed up versions this evening, but my personal preference is to draw them by hand, and if you really want a digital record, then take a photograph of it so that you can upload it to reports and presentations. So when you come to write it up, it might be useful for you to have lots of brown paper and post-its, and the advantage of using post-its, obviously, is that you can move them about and play with them. And that's really beneficial when you start to have some of the discussions about flow, and it becomes particularly helpful when you try to define your future state map, which we'll come on to a little bit later. So the next step is to define your process steps. Now, like no other tool in the Lean sort of box at all, but value stream mapping is the best way to teach yourself and colleagues how to see value and how to spot waste. Try to get into the habit, if you can, of always being really mindful of what is value. So what is it that the patient needs from my service or from my department processes? And really to get your head into answering that question continually, you really ought to start documenting the map from the end of the process and working up the value stream. Now, the reason for doing that is because it urges you to question and be quite critical of what is truly value add at each stage as you go. So your map will start to look something like that, and then as you go along, you're going to start to put in all the external departments and organisations that might impact your process at that stage. And these might be very few, but sometimes you can become quite surprised at how many teams you might need to liaise with when making improvements in your service. You might actually need to go talk to people outside of your own department. The next step is to add in your information flow. Now these might be electronic forms of communication, or it might be paper. And you'll start to see when you do it that being mindful of all those really value-added activities, i.e. start at the end of the process and work your way upstream, it becomes important when you're thinking about information flow, because the question that you should keep asking is, how can we flow information so that one process will only perform when the next process actually needs it? That's what you're trying to get to with your information flow. And then you're going to start to insert arrows between your process boxes, indicating whether the work is being pushed or pulled at each stage. Now, push typically results from continuing to produce work, whether this be blocks or slides or scans, images, reports, letters, whatever that work is, it's producing that work continually to a schedule that is just guessing what the next process needs. So that's what push would be, or simply having no regard as to whether the next process step is ready or not. That's a kind of push system. This is kind of what your map will start to look like. The next step is where you're going to collect some timings. Now, the key here is to keep your measurement really consistent. So collecting seconds or minutes or hours, whatever is apt for your service, But remember, everybody who looks at this map needs to understand it once you've finished. So ensure that you don't end up with overly long numbers to convert or to compute in your head. So this is where your stopwatch comes in. You're going to look at the cycle time. To be sure how long it really takes to do one item, it's advised that you do 20 consecutive timings for each step. Now, I have done it with 10 timings, and that really, don't get hung up on how many timings you've actually got. As long as it's believable and agreed by the whole team, that's the key thing. You know, is that reasonable to assume that that cycle time takes that amount of time? Remember, the cycle time is all about the operator, the individual member of staff. So as long, you know, if you have data entry, as you can see there, if you have 10 booking clerks who all entry data onto a system in a very different way, you don't have a standardized process as yet in place for doing that. Time taken will vary between staff. So just make sure that the cycle time you put down at this stage is representative of that. Okay. The batch size, this is really important to collect, as it'll give you a really good indication as to whether you've got lots of stop-start activity going on. You know, are you batching and pushing stuff, which is making it really impossible to have a smooth flow of work, and inevitably a queue will build up. Defects, ask the staff as you go around on the walk around. You know, ask them questions like, you know, out of every 10 you do, how many can you not process first time round or have to be reworked on later? Now, you might be surprised by the figure you get there. It might be higher than you first thought. We've had people come, you know, scratching their heads saying, I can't believe I've got a 30 to 40% defect rate at this process step. Well, the reason that you've probably never spotted them before is that you probably had too many waiting to be done in a triangle. I'll come on to triangles in a minute. And it's kind of masking the problem. So sometimes you don't really understand what the defect rate actually is until you go walk that process and talk to those staff. And the other key thing is to make certain that you establish with the staff who perform that process step what causes that process step to start. Because we all have assumptions about our service in what triggers what step. And sometimes it's actually not like that when you actually talk to the people on the ground actually doing it. So your map will be starting to build up quite nicely. It's starting to look quite fairly full. Then we're going to start inserting the measures into the timeline. Now, the timeline is the cancellation sort of line. You can see the turrets at the bottom of the map. Now, the cycle time is literally just transposed into each immediately down from under its time box in the under the process box onto that line. So literally it's easy to put all your cycle times in the corresponding on the corresponding line below each box. But then you need to add the time delays between the process steps. So this is the time waiting between steps. Now, it may be that this is known to you. You may know what the waiting time is between steps already. So, for instance, in this one, this could be a radiology example, between vetting the referral and booking the scan, it might actually take 3 weeks. It might sit somewhere with a booking clerk in order for it to be booked, and that amount of waiting time might be 3 weeks. So in which case you'd convert the 3 weeks into your consistent unit of time. So if in this instance it's in minutes, we might actually put 30,240 minutes on the line below. So you can see the numbers then start to look really big and cumbersome. It might be that you don't know what the waiting time is between steps, and you might need to measure that a bit further, or it might be appropriate for you to calculate how long it would take to clear the backlog by multiplying the work in progress or the inventory between steps by the cycle time. But to do that, you're going to need the next step, which is actually calculating the inventory. What is sitting where, waiting to be worked on between process steps? Now, inserting the inventory between steps, immediately you're creating a warning triangle. And remember, inventory accumulates where flow is stopping. So this should be big signal to you that actually there's a bit of a problem going on here. Either we're batching, or we're not managing, or actually it's not too far out of control. But it needs watching. They are warning triangles. Okay. So then on your map, you're going to insert the number of people who are on duty, who perform that process step at any one time. Now remember, this isn't how many staff you have on your establishment who can do that job in total. It's just how many staff actually do it that shift, that day. And it may be that the day that you were mapping, it was a pretty bad day in terms of sickness or annual leave or whatever, and you were depleted in staff. So look at what happens 80% of the time. How many staff do we actually have on duty performing that step? And then calculate your touch time by adding up all your cycle times. And then your lead time. Now this is your start to finish time. Okay, so add up all the figures along the whole timeline together. And this includes all your value add and all your non-value add activity. And then take a really long, hard look at those two figures, comparing your touch time to your lead time. So this is what you could end up with, something that looks a little bit like that. So what do we want to do with it? You then start to ask some questions. Why does it take 3 months to do only 27 minutes of hands-on work for the patient? And we might feel very, very, very busy, but actually can we increase that value-added time activity that we perform every day? And at this point, in order to answer some of those questions, you might want to collate further some of the ideas and the issues, and you really might want to start getting your team involved with looking at, what can we do? What this is a big problem. Can we actually start to redesign our process? So this is where we come into the future state mapping. Now, the whole point of value stream mapping is to really understand flow and to highlight the sources of waste and eliminate them. So if you don't make a future state map soon after your current state, then the efforts in mapping themselves have just been pure waste. You really need to get down to, what does the future state look like? Okay, so now we can go about, the whole task of trying to establish flow, eliminate waste, and add some value into our processes. So here's what we need in order to define our future state. Most importantly, I would say you need to have a bit of an open mind. An open mind to the possibilities of what your processes could be and what your service could look like. Now, if you consider all of those steps, and we had some clear process steps, which for the moment we'll take on the chin, are all value added. Some of them might not be, but for the moment we'll pretend they all are. And there were some weights in between. So we can represent this, just for argument's sake, on a like this, as the green bars being the value added steps, and the red being the waste in between. And our aim in designing a future state is to get rid of that waste. So we want to keep the green and we want to get rid of that waste. Okay, we don't want to whip the green bits into working harder and faster, because they're the value-added activities anyway. Okay, so we're not about making the staff work harder and faster, we're just trying to cut down on the weights in between. So this is it. We're going to try, if we can, this is the aim in our redesign efforts, to get all those value-added bits as close together as we can and to remove the weights. Now, in any lean improvement effort, we should begin to try slashing by 50% initially. That's kind of what we go for. Always try to halve it on your first stab, if you can. Try to go for 50%. And if you don't remember anything from this whole webinar this evening, I'd like you to remember the acronym SEX. Now, for those of you who are just nodding off, I've probably got your full attention again, and for those of you who you were listening with intent are now going to find it really hard to concentrate. But we're at that point where we need to consider what the future state will look like. So how can we get rid of those triangles and all those red areas that was on that last graphic, the weights, in other words, on our maps? Where can we eliminate the triangles? And more importantly, what can we do if we can't? So this is SEX. Now the aim is to eliminate what you can, combine if you must, simplify as much as you can, and then look at the whole sequence. So this is the order that you really ought to do it in. So the acronym really is X, but nobody remembers that. So eliminate, combine, simplify, and then look at the sequence. Now applying this to our value stream map, when we're trying to look at the future state, means, especially with this one, where it was 3 months to do half an hour's work, we need to initially go for the big numbers. So where can we eliminate? Where can we either get rid of either those big numbers or the high volumes of work waiting between steps? If we can't eliminate them, can we combine some? So could we set up a work cell? If we can't eliminate the triangle completely, can we manage it by putting in a buffer system? So as we can see in this illustration, this is scans, but this could be slides if it were pathology. They're being produced at a rate where the consultant can't report them immediately. So we start to get a build-up. Now, the buffer is a kind of managed operation where we say how many are going to be produced before we stop the line or we seek assistance from another consultant. And some teams they put in electronic visuals of RAG statuses, of your red, amber, green status, on an electronic system to flag that process step is actually gaining a backlog. Queue is starting to form somewhere. What we're really working towards, though, is pull. So the one thing about a buffer is it's really an operationally managed triangle. It might be managed, but the aim ultimately is not to work to a buffer system. The aim ultimately is to work to pull. But in doing so, it is worth us attempting to put in buffer systems where we can. So the overall aim is to eliminate or to combine as much as you can, simplifying processes as you go, and only then, when you've done as much as you can in all of that waste, would you then start to reduce individual cycle times in order to get below the whole pace of what your system needs to work at. And that will be based on your data, based on your demand data. So the future state map is the most important in your service improvement efforts, in my opinion. It's not just about your current state. Think about the work cells. Think about where you might be able to put in, first out systems if you can't truly move to pull. Consider putting in buffers so that the queues and backlog don't really get out of control. And ask yourself, where can you truly put in a system that might be based on pull? And the key thing I'd say about the future state is don't get hung up on the detail, because you're going to fine-tune it as you go along anyway. Just remember that the principles of lean management systems is that we're trying to get to one process doing what the next process needs when it needs it. So for you on this course, transposing these into your A3s lends to defining your action plan. And remember to document your plans with the who, what, where, when, how, your agreed measures of success, and any identified barriers and risks. Also remember that your improvement should be built on repetitive PDCA cycles. Some of you know them as PDSA cycles. It's the same thing. But like a PDSA cycle, your maps should be a really iterative process for you to visit again and again. And the aim is once you've got to future state, it's that whole iterative process goes round again. That then becomes the current state. So this concludes the Phoenix Consulting webinar on value stream mapping. Thanks all for listening.